start going the scientific route of just doing comparative analysis in your grow room, you don't really care what other people are doing. I just care about my experiments and learning what I'm learning. And so I was pretty recluse in my cultivation. That's why I was on the internet about strains as well, is because I didn't want to socialize with local growers. I saw it as a risk. I would rather be one person removed from them in my dealings. So like a lot of the time I wasn't trying to get friendly with.
We're Jug Dealers, we're the podcast you need in your feed, teaching the game like you never seen. Jared, Gabe, Rambo, true OGs, masters of the globe, set your mind free. From Denver, Colorado, where the deck is green, we set the data points for the SOPs. Jug Dealers Podcast, yes indeed.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Jug Dealers Podcast, where we discuss all things cannabis and lifestyle related. Brought to you by the good people at 5/8 Distributing, and JugDealers.net is now up and running. We actually had a bunch of orders go out yesterday, which we appreciate. So if you can't find it at your local shop, go to JugDealers.net, place your order, and we will get it back to you. But today we have a very, very special episode. We have my good buddy Fletcher from Archive in studio, and we are going to discuss a bunch of different topics with him. Fletcher, welcome to the studio.
Thanks, man.
You know, this is one I've been wanting to do for a long time. As our listeners know, we like to bring the history, bring the stories, bring the people who were there. And you were definitely one of the people who was relevant in a lot of these things. But as usual, we like to start the story at the beginning so we can get a little history of our listeners. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, that kind of thing.
I kind of grew up all over. Originally born in California, grew up in Virginia, ended up in Washington in 10th grade. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really smoke weed as a kid. I was interested in it. The internet was available. So you had, you could search Google and learn about it, overgrow, all those things were, and I was on overgrow before I was growing weed. Mm-hmm. Because I was interested in weed, and that was really the best place to get information, particularly about cultivation. Because I grew up growing orchids.
In Virginia,
when I moved to Washington, my dad had remarried, and my stepmom, she had some friends that were into orchids, mm-hmm. And so I just kind of took an interest in them, started getting some, and I had some previous experiences with just agricultural stuff with my family. Going to agricultural expos and stuff as a kid. So I just always had this interest in agriculture, and then orchids kind of was low maintenance enough in high school, at least, to have a few, 10 of them in your room or something like that. And then I learned about cannabis and saw good cannabis in Washington State, which I'd only ever seen brickweed mm-hmm. back east, because we're talking late common. 90s, early 2000s.
Okay.
And, so I didn't really take an interest in weed until I moved to Washington, and then I had seen some really high quality, like jar herb that came in mason jars.
Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, it was all the strains that were like Albert Walker, Dog Shit, Super Bill, the UW Purple Indica, other UW strains like there was one called the Lemon Bomb or. Mm-hmm. And then, just all kinds of local strains there. And there was because of the glass scene, the glass blowing scene in Seattle.
Yep.
There was just a pretty high quality niche market for well-preserved, well-grown herb of any strain. And in particular in Washington, hazes and sativas were probably the most desired from how much you're paying for it.
I mean, I remember getting the UW from a friend of mine in 1995, and it was like it was out of this world at the time for anybody. Like you said, like most of us had seen kind of Mexican brickweed. Some of us, I think I tell this story where the first weed I had seen was Shiva Shanti in 1995. But then later that year, I had a friend who moved out there, and he showed me the UW, and I was just like, I mean, still to this day, when I think about it, it really is one of the top strains. I think I don't know if it was just the allure of it at the time or what, but it was just such a cool strain. So I definitely I definitely feel you on that one. As far as, had you seen that? Because I know you're a big fan of the Trinity. Had you seen the Trinity yet at that time too?
That was maybe a couple years later, but yeah, that was all part of the same thing. I mean, essentially, I was connected with my friend Jeff, who's Cannabis Reverend. He was like one of the first people bringing bubble bags into America. And my other friend Shaw, who's 707 Seed Bank.
Okay.
They were friends. So I just kind of happened to meet Jeff because Jeff went to the same high school that I had transferred
high school,
to.
Bro.
Yeah,
I mean, that's killer.
Yeah, I was in, I think probably, I'm trying to think when I met Jeff, it was probably like, I guess I would say starting junior year, sometime junior year of high school. I started getting access to the herb that was coming through Jeff and all those kind of guys. And
so you're smoking weed at this point? Like you've gotten to the point. Do you remember, I ask pretty much every viewer or listener of this, do you remember your first smoking experience, like in specific? Or were you just, was it like summer? You were just starting to hang out with some kids and stuff?
Yeah, I don't remember like the very first time specifically, but I know that the first weed I smoked was good herb, like locally grown herb, because I had seen brickweed and that's pretty unappealing. And I had seen like beasters and was selling some beasters, or had bought some, maybe I smoked a bowl of beaster first, but I know I basically, from what I can remember, I basically had access to beaster and locally homegrown weed in Seattle. And it was like $200 to $300 an ounce for beasters. And it was $40 an eighth or $50 an eighth for all the local homegrown stuff. Didn't matter if you wanted a quarter pound, it'd be like $1,200 or whatever.
So, I mean, you've already, you pretty much laid it out, you already had an interest in plants and all the rest of this. So how does that transfer to what's your first cultivation experience, we'll say? I started growing a plant in my bedroom, like behind my like a closet not a walk-in closet, but like a closet shelving system. And my dad found it and I put it outside. And then I had a friend, his name's Elliot, who the strain Smelliot, which was a clone I acquired. And he was one of the first ones to grow it because I graduated high school at 17 and I just I spent 3 months in Canada because I was considering moving to Canada to up in Vancouver, or
half my family's from Quebec. So I went to Quebec for 3 months. Like I'd finished high school early, basically in like March, and I went to Quebec for 3 months and was considering just moving to Canada to do it because the repercussions were way less. And at the time, Canada was kind of the epicenter of the genetic scene of cannabis, especially Vancouver.
Yeah,
like
I had a lot of friends that were in Vancouver. I had friends, I was running the border in the Kootenays in the mid 90s. And then, I ended up getting a bunch of friends up there who, again, same thing. They had wild genetic stuff you had never seen in the mid 90s. You're like, what is this stuff? So you're absolutely right. Like for us, that kind of was the epicenter of good genetics in the United States at the time,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, essentially what had happened is Amsterdam was the original seed supplier because you had the seed bank, SSSC, Sensi Seeds, et cetera. But as the 90s came around, the war on drugs in cannabis was pretty heavy in the 90s in America. And it kind of translated to trying to get seeds from Europe in terms of getting them from Amsterdam. Everyone knew the gig was up after they had busted Neville and done all that. So at the time, Vancouver and BC were basically becoming very tolerant of cannabis because you had Mark Emery up there with Cannabis Culture Magazine. And you had
Blunt Brothers up there. Were they like selling
They were probably another seed. Yeah, there was a bunch of different little seed, basically closets. They were just little tiny offits.
Over on Hastings, I remember.
Exactly. That you would sell seeds. And there was a handful of different guys. But, Mark Emery obviously being the most prominent of them. And there was a handful. And then you had all the guys supplying seeds for those guys. And essentially what was available is mostly strains that had been collected in the Pacific Northwest, which was really kind of the first place that indoor growing started up. That's why Northern Lights is from Seattle. And so basically, the Northwest in general was a pretty influential area in terms of just cultivators popping seeds, growing stuff, hybridizing it, which was pretty rare, I think, back then. Most people were just trying to grow some plants, not breed or do anything beyond that. Just because the risk of doing it was so high, why are you going to risk it on a research and development project, theoretically?
Well, it's so funny you say that, because I really, when I was thinking about this episode and putting it together, I really was, going to kind of coin you as one of the fathers of American genetics. And
I carried the torch a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, that's true. I was trying to think about, like, were there people really before that doing much? And a lot, when I talk about the Shiva Shanti, though, that was Dutch seeds that people were growing over here, so it's definitely, it's interesting to get your perspective of it for sure, because that really was a time where things were starting to change. So in my understanding at the time as well, didn't a lot of this, like through that, let's say 2000, 2010 period, didn't a lot of genetics just disappear because people got busted and all of a sudden, this clone that some guy didn't give out, like, gone,
I think that's true from the beginning of indoor growing. I think when it was an outdoor, mostly grower market prior to, let's say, 1980-ish, when the first HID lighting came out, no one was really keeping clones. It was the process of making clones was relatively unknown at that time, unless you were reading books about it or had other agricultural knowledge. Excuse me. So, I think the war on drugs, I mean, that was really the thing when I got into weed, and coming from kind of just learning about orchids and other agricultural, orchids is one of the most diverse species on the planet of plant genus. So, it's really, I looked at it, and essentially in like the 1800s, there was this giant agricultural wave that kind of hit Europe and England, and basically people were trying to go around the world to find plants so they could name it after themselves and secure their place in history. And you'd come back to England and describe it in a book. And essentially I just, after reading all that about orchids and other plants as well, looking at the war on drugs, I knew we were losing genetic stock. And not only was it hard to get, it was hard to meet the people to gain access. You had to do all kinds of risky things or financially expensive things to get access or to gain the trust of that group. And I just knew that if no one is out there focusing on collecting that stuff and trying to preserve it, it likely would get lost to the test of time, especially when you look at how fast strains recycle in the cannabis market. It's a gelato heavy market today, and you can't find people that have sour diesel clones, whereas 15 years ago, almost every grow had a sour and a real sour clone in there somewhere. Someone got it from their buddy, got it from Fort Collins, got it from New York, got it from the West Coast. I mean, the things made their way around because there were so few people popping seeds and making selections that
and you didn't give it to people. When I got the diesel in 2000, my buddy flew it out in a spring green salad. So we're talking, this is before TSA. And the rule was, you don't give it to anybody. Now, I say to people all the time, did we bring sour diesel to Colorado? Hell yeah. Did I ever give anybody a cut? Hell no. Is there a possibility that there was a seed in some of my weed that someone popped and called sour diesel? Hell yeah. So it's definitely one of those things. But, you and I are from a time where, there was a code. And if someone gave someone gave you something and said, do not give this to anybody, you didn't give it to anybody.
Well, almost everybody did end up giving it to at least one person, because you're trying to preserve it within your friend circle. Because once you don't have it, you can't get it, and you can't just go buy seeds of it and reacquire it or repop it. So that was a major concern for a lot of people. And that's why the strains that have made it did survive. And that was kind of what I made my mission in my early cultivation career, was to try to gain access to all those different groups of people and acquire their genetics and preserve them. And that's why, like I said, the first weeds homegrown good herb I smoked, half of those strains I have the clone of still to this day. Albert Walker, dog shit. I don't have the pure Malawi gold that came from back then, but I have a Malawi NL Hayes cross that I made. A strain called the Corn.
So I guess that,
And that was where the archive name came from.
I was about to say this. That was one of my questions, but hence the name archive. So, I mean, going past that, what was your, like, when did you decide that you really wanted to start breeding, and what was your first breeding project, and was it successful?
I realized it before I started growing that I wanted to preserve these plants and do it. And essentially, I didn't have access when I started growing. I didn't really have any local mentors or anything else like that. I just dove straight into books. And once you read enough books and you start going the scientific route of just doing comparative analysis in your grow room, you don't really care what other people are doing. I just care about my experiments and learning what I'm learning. And so I was pretty recluse in my cultivation. That's why I was on the internet about strains as well, is because I didn't want to socialize with local growers. I saw it as a risk. I would rather be one person removed from them in my dealings. So like a lot of the time I wasn't trying to get friendly with the other grower that grew these strains locally.
Or you're at the grow store and some guy's trying to talk to you and you're like, I gotta go, bro.
Yeah, even for them, I didn't want to know the other grower. I wanted to know the guy that they sold all their weed to. And then I would make it financially impossible for them to not want to give me the clone by either growing weed for them, right? And giving them the first pounds, or making sure I sell all the weed to them of those strains because they want to take it and resell it. Or I can contribute a strain back to their gardens that will help their production, things that they wanted from me. That's what it was for me. And I wasn't necessarily I was just trying to get access to whoever I could get access to, not necessarily get to the top of the chain and have a mentor grower buddy. That wasn't really my concern. My concern was what's the easiest way to get this clone so that I can preserve it. And then the other thing is, just like archive, I always give the clone back to the guys that gave it to me. And you can ask anybody that gave me all those old clones. I've given them their shit back multiple times in my life, not just once, not just twice, multiple times over multiple decades.
No, I definitely, one of the things I really respect about you is even the people who don't like you in the industry, they really can't talk shit on you, bro. Like you've been from day one, you've been one of the real ones, and you're pretty upfront and forward. I mean, it's funny because I remember when I first met you at ADSI, I always tell people like, we didn't really like each other when we first met each other. And there were a bunch of opinions that you had where I was like, this guy's out of his friggin' mind. Truth of the matter is, 14 years later, you were right about almost all of it. And
Nugstradamus.
And honestly, that's something I've always really respected about you, in that facet, is the fact that, you're honest about things, and people may not like that, but the truth of the matter is you're coming from a place of experience, and you're coming from a place of having built all this, having really been a major contributor to the United States seed market and just, cannabis culture in general. So,
I mean, my goal is to just maintain a standard of appreciation for what a lot of people went through for us to even have what we have. That was a big part of the archive thing too, is to collect these things from guys that may stop growing. And then they want to start back up, and I give them their original clone back. And I just wanted to make sure that we're preserving that genetic history, because once it's gone, it's gone.
Yeah,
you can't get it back. There's no, we'll just pop some landrace seeds and re-find it. And kind of answer your question earlier, the reason that I figured out I wanted to breed cannabis with the first time I grew seeds, which was my very first grow. I went to Amsterdam and smuggled seeds back in the tongue of my shoe when I was 16. Went there with my mom.
That's great, bro.
Yeah,
that's so great.
So, I mean, my whole life's been weed growing. I've never done anything else but grow weed professionally. So you,
at this time, we're talking mid 2000s, you're in the forums as well.
Yep.
And that,
I was 16 on the forums.
So I saw, I try to prepare for this, even though we've known each other, there's a lot of stuff still don't know, obviously, but, was the doctor your name on the forums? And so, I always like to discuss this with people, because I was one of the guys who was growing at the time where, like, you couldn't have paid me to go on a forum. Like
Right.
I was so scared, and so, what, like, who were you interacting with? And then the other question I had that I just know from talking to like root cellar and stuff was, were you part of Devil's Harvest crew? Was that kind of like, what was the story behind the Devil's Harvest crew?
Well, let me think where to start here. So I was not a member of Devil's Harvest crew.
Yeah.
And I'm not really like a crew type person.
100%.
I'm an independent kind of person, independent thinker. I don't really like group action type stuff. It's not really my thing. So I was just an associate, and I was mainly friendly with Weedzilla, who was the founder of it, and Moonshine Man a little bit for a couple years. And then I had later re-met him when I moved out here to Colorado, which is a whole other story. But the at that time, just the DHK was really Moonshine Man, this guy E-Rock, this other guy Outdoor Grower, Weedzilla. But honestly, I wasn't really like the most social butterfly on the forums, I was more stick to the strains. Like, you didn't ever see me hanging out in any forum other than strains and breeding. That was all I cared about. I wasn't in the other forum sections where it was personal life stuff. You're, talking to people, just shooting the shit. It was like, dude, you either got strains and you're really into this growing shit, or you're not. And that was all it was to me.
Well, it's funny because I always thought about it too, where like, people didn't know who each other were back then.
No, I didn't want to know.
You just had a name. And since the scene has expanded and most of us went legal, all of a sudden, if you had beef with someone or there was some type of gripe or whatever, like all of a sudden you're kind of meeting people in person and you're like, oh, wait.
the only guys that I met in person, essentially like, so the DHK stuff and all that was really more of a overgrow.com kind of group. And I was more into Cannabis World, which was the sister site.
Okay.
Where there was way less of the riffraff.
Of the drama and stuff. Yeah.
There was still drama because Cannabis World was basically the customer service forum for CBay, which was the first eBay auction site for seeds, which was run by this guy, RC, which ran the Seed Bank Heaven's Stairway out of Quebec, Canada.
Okay.
Then RC got busted in 2005, and with it went overgrow.com, cannabisworld.com, and Heaven's Stairway, the seed bank.
Okay.
And that was the first wave, I would call it, of internet seed sales that ended. And maybe around like 2003 would be my guess. 2002, 2003, Gypsy Nirvana with Seeds Direct became a mail order seed seller that would ship to America. And essentially like the Attitude Seeds of the 2010s was Seeds Direct of the late 90s and early 2000s. They're the biggest mail order seed company. Them and Mark Emery were probably the biggest at that time.
Okay.
And so Seeds Direct ended up becoming icmag.com, which is what most people are more familiar with today.
That's what I'm more familiar with.
Simply because Overgrow and Cannabis World had been shut down and seized by the RCMP in Canada. And so that was that first wave of genetic distribution that really set the tone for the future of online cannabis seeds and clone stuff. That was when it changed. 2005 I think it was 2005 that happened. And then after that is when ICMag, THC Farmer, and all these basically new iterations of what was Overgrow and Cannabis World came about. And there were some other websites at that, like in the Overgrow Cannabis World time, like private websites that had private members. And so Cannabis World was really where I hung out. And I had told you that I'd met 707 Seed Bank with my buddy Jeff when I was like 17. So I got this clone that was called Cat Piss from San Diego, California, from my buddy Philly. And Philly was this like big trapper in Seattle, like pretty well known Rainbow Family Gathering type of dude. And Philly was a source for some clones. I didn't know who he got the clones from. I wasn't trying to get to know his growers all over the place, but Philly bought a lot of weed back then. And so he had access to clones and strains. And so I got like a bubblegum clone from him that's different than the Indiana bubblegum and arguably better. And I didn't keep it from back then. But I had given it to Oregon Kid and he gave it to another friend of his, and it's still in Washington somewhere. I just haven't gotten it back, but it was actually a pretty good clone. And that San Diego clone or San Diego cat piss clone was another one that I got from Philly. And I remember that one cost me some money. I must have spent like at least $2,500 or $5,000,
which
between either doing stuff for him or giving him weed, or I can't remember what it was that I did. But I remember that one. I was like, this one. I mean, I was a broke kid. I didn't have any money. I was learning how to grow weed by myself. So, and that was kind of, so the scene was that, and that San Diego cat piss clone, Shawbud, 707 Seed Bank, he'd been looking for the cat piss that's from Pittsburgh, California, where he's from. This obviously isn't the same clone. He was later find that clone, and I called that NorCal cat piss in my gardens, and that's strains like Stink Bomb that I made and stuff are cat piss hybrids, his cat piss hybrids. So I ended up meeting him in like Eugene, Oregon to like trade clones in, I don't know, 2004 or 5. And he gave me Bubba, and I gave him the San Diego cat piss. And that was probably the first, I'm pretty sure that was the first time I'd ever met anybody from online. Right. And what was really funny about it is I had met him 2 years earlier or 3 years earlier at Jeff's house. So we like show up at this motel.
So you didn't realize it was him until he showed up, and then you're like, hey, I know you.
He had dreadlocks and stuff when I had first met him, and he had cut all his hair off. And so I meet him at the hotel room at this like hotel, and we, this was us just exchanging messages. I don't even think we gave each other our phone numbers.
Yeah. And right? for our listeners, smartphones didn't exist yet.
No, no.
iPhones didn't.
No, I don't even think I had a cell phone. I think it was like, this is where we're meeting up on this day. And yeah, or maybe I did have probably a cell phone. I probably had like a Nokia.
Flip.
Yeah. Like a Nokia brick. That's it. Right. And I think he told me like, this is the room I'm staying at. And I mean, shit, I was so poor at the time. We both fucking stayed in the same room that night, just hung out, smoked weed, talked about strains, realized that he was like, did I meet you a couple years ago? Do you know Jeff? And I was like, I do know Jeff. Right. He's like, dude, that was me. And so, and that was like my first friend online. And fortunately for me, I guess in that circumstance, he was good friends with the people that ran the private section of the cannabisworld.com forum. And so I think that next year he invited me to go down to the Cannabis World Cups that we used to have, which was like a competition. And that would be where the Tom Hills and the Rosso Refos and the Elk Slayers and all the like really well-known online guys at that time would all go to Rosso's house, and we'd have a cup there. And that's where I met like CSI Humboldt, who ended up becoming, I'd say out of that whole group, CSI Humboldt and Caleb and Shaw at 707 Seed Bank are my closest friends from that era. And we've always shared clones. And that's why essentially, if you look at any of Caleb's catalog that are strains from back then and mine, vice versa, those are clones we shared with each other. They're exact same clones. And we basically, him and I were the, sleuthing detectives of trying to find old strains and preserve them.
And I mean, you were, the real stewards of the plant. I mean, that
was the goal. Exactly.
So hold on a second. I'm going to pull up I had an entire list of questions because I know it goes deep. What brought you to Colorado when you made the move down here, and how long were you down here? Did you, what was your time down here like?
So, another one of the people that I met at the Cannabis World Cups, which that was pretty much the crew that those are the people I associated with. And, like I said, I wasn't super social outside of that because
you're still not super social. Trust me, the Billies was a shock to me.
Right. Well, I mean, I did a lot of high times events. I mean, I'll force myself to do it, but I'd rather be, on a remote property in a tractor most of the time. So, at the end of the day, that whole scene was really the epicenter of online genetics trading in in the world, as far as I was concerned. You know, I know it wasn't all that it was, but even still to this day, most of the rest of the world looks back to America for genetics. And that at that time, that was my thought was, you know, all the stuff in Amsterdam's all been done. All the stuff in Canada's all been done, but we got all these clone onlys in America that no one is preserving and making sure they stay alive. And that was kind of my mission. That was Caleb's mission as well. There was a few of us. I'm not saying I was the only one, but it was, you know, me and Caleb that was my partner in crime in that endeavor, you know.
When did you do the face off?
That was seeds I popped in 2007, and I received those from the real OG Cushman, who is the source. The source genetics. So Chris lived in Seattle for a couple years, maybe 3 years. And I met him through, I'm trying to remember. Through this guy who went by Pig online, who was from New York City, didn't have a driver's license even, because why would you need one if you're from New York? And he was the sour diesel guy, kind of.
Okay.
And he had some kind of connection with Seattle. I don't remember. Maybe it was his chick or something. And I had met him a couple times and just traded some herb with him. I don't think he was really much of a grower, but was a high-end connoisseur, so knew growers, and introduced me to Chris. And Chris likes golf. I played golf a lot at that time. And so we just kind of bonded, and Chris is one of the funniest people I know.
He's a great human. He's
a really hilarious person as well. So we would just have a great time getting stoned, and he had a real serious girlfriend at that time that he was with, and we would just laugh. And that was essentially my first experience with like what I would call really well-grown, tasty OG Kush. And that was his bag seed that he had popped from late 90s. And that was the poison OG that we ended up calling it. I think me and him ended up naming that together, like at his house. Because I think he just called it like OG S1 number, whatever. I can't remember what he called it, but and so I'm trying to remember. So that was how I met Chris, and he knew that I pop seeds and collect strains, and I had given him a bunch of clones as well when he moved out of Seattle. And he gave me, I think it was 4 or 5 face-off seeds. And the face-off OG number 4 was the clone. But the thing is like the weed he purchased that those bag seeds came from was just called OG Kush. It wasn't face-off OG, some clone. It was just OG. And his buddy that bought those pounds and were selling it called it face-off OG because they were basically saying this is the best OG out there. That's why it's $8,000 a pound, and we'll have a face-off with your shit about it. And it had something to do with the moving being out at the time too with Nicolas Cage. Right. I don't remember it, but it's just like the same thing when the Skywalker OG and the Star Wars movies had just popped off.
Yep.
The same thing happens
Death
today
Star,
too.
A bunch of those genetics.
Exactly.
I got that face-off from Stan the Strain Man.
Right. And I given it to Scott.
And Scott Reach.
Yeah.
And it's still to this day, it's one of my favorites as far as the OGs. It's just, but
it's different.
Temperamental, you gotta treat it right. You gotta take care of it. But interesting. I didn't realize that was a bag seed, and I definitely didn't realize it was from Chris. So And so I popped those seeds, and then I crossed it with this strain called the Manic that I had gotten from Shroomy 420, the guy that made Shroom, or said he made Shroom, and he was also a prolific trader online. He wasn't part of the Devil's Harvest crew, but again, he was an associate, kind of like myself. We ended up trading clones with some of those people. Like I got the HP1 from Weedzilla, and I'd gotten some strains from Scott too, like Maple Leaf Indica and his blueberry clone and a couple other things. But none of that stuff, the HP1 or any of those, never ended up being something that I ended up keeping because I have some hash plant clones and washing. So it was like HP1 wasn't really that special to me because I had access to lots of hash plants. And then the Oregon blueberry that Scott had out here wasn't really the blueberry I was looking for from Washington. So it's just like a lot of the stuff was just like any strain.
different locations have different versions of it because different people pop seeds back then.
Yep.
And you found something that smelled like his blueberry smells blueberry for sure. So it's like, it's not like there was anything wrong with his. It just wasn't the one I was looking for because I was looking for the one that was from Bellevue, Washington, not wherever his had come from,
Right.
Colorado or wherever.
So how long did you spend down here? And then you went back to, I'm assuming you went straight back to Washington.
Yeah. So I came out here because I had all those friends from the forums. And there was like Houster grower who I ended up staying with for like a couple weeks while I was waiting. Essentially, I had rented a house. I either had rented a house or I was looking for a place.
Boulder.
He's down like south of town, kind of a little past DU.
Okay.
So I was looking for a place kind of around DU that had a basement that I could grow weed in.
I used to grow weed in Englewood. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I stayed at his place for a few weeks and kind of, just tried to help as much as I could with his little grow or help him build a little grow room or do whatever. And so I stayed at his place and I'm trying to remember there was, who else was out here? Well, I'm trying to think of some of the other forum names, but
I was gonna say no Root Cellar.
Scott. Scott was out here, but I didn't know Scott. I'd kind of stopped talking to him after we had traded clones online, and I ended up like going up to his dispensary and meeting him, and then that's a whole other story. But the main person out here that I knew well was Chip from Cultivate Supply or Cultivate.
Yeah, Chip's the homie, dude. Chip's
right,
a good friend of the show.
So Chip's from Humboldt, and or not from Humboldt, he's from Georgia, but he had been growing in Humboldt for a long time, and so he was like one of the main characters. In his online handle was Seaweed. And so the Cannabis World Cups, he was like the next one of Rosso's next door neighbors, essentially, just like a lot of the guys were. Because a lot of like NCGA was another guy. These were all guys that had kind of ended up in the Emerald Triangle and then brought people with them.
And as I remember, was Chip did Royal Gold Soil?
Chip started Royal Gold.
Yep,
so at that time, Chip was in Humboldt. And he had his property out there and he was doing Royal Gold Soil and he had his partner, Chad, I believe his name was. And I think Chad and another partner ended up buying Chip out and Chip moved to Colorado and started Cultivate. And then now he has Growers Cocoa, which is also manufactured out here in Colorado.
Yep. Yeah, no, Chip's good friend of the show. I mean, honestly, I think Cultivate may do the most business for us in Colorado of any grow store. So,
100%.
I mean, those guys are 100% family.
No, and Chip's a old school grower as they come. I mean, he's been around since the 90s and he's always, he's just a straight up dude. I'm from Virginia. He's from Georgia. We just have the same type of humor and he's a great friend of mine. I
wanted to ask you earlier on the Virginia tip. Did you ever know anything about Floyd, Virginia, when you were living there?
No, like I wasn't in the weed scene when I was in Virginia.
I figured when you said you left
like
in 10th
15.
grade, I didn't think so. But just going to some of the grow stores down there, I actually learned that like Floyd is like a huge producer of cannabis and has been like since the 80s type stuff. I went into the grow store and the guy's like, yeah, we grow tons of weed around here. I was like, really? But it makes sense because that part of the state is definitely different than the other part of the other side of the state.
Well, and moonshining is historically very significant in that area. So people don't care as much about the law in general.
You know, it's funny. Just my time that I've been spending in Virginia, going to some of the stores and stuff, you get a lot of people in the stores since they've legalized and been able to grow their 4 plants. And you get a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, I grow my 4 plants. I don't even smoke the stuff, but it's my right. And I'm going to grow it. And you're like, cool, awesome.
Exactly.
I just give it away to my family.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it is a very rich agricultural culture down there. And I got to be honest with you. I spend time in Virginia all the time seeing my girl and I love it down there. I really do. I didn't know till I spent some time. She's down Stanton, like on the west side, kind of where you're from.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's cool country. I'll be eager to see what happens when the South finally starts to, Virginia, like the way they've structured the laws is so Virginia at this point because it's rec and it's legal, but there's no stores. There's no way to get it. So,
well, and it's crazy because we used to make jokes that you'd never see legalization because places like Oklahoma and Virginia would never have it. And then now you look at the landscape of legalized states, and particularly Virginia, they have home grow, whereas like Washington, which was like the second state, still doesn't even have home grow. And you can really see where the corporate interests lie. And, potentially in Virginia's case, where the lawmakers there did preserve the rights of the people in some fashion.
Right.
Whereas the Washington just sold everybody out to the highest bidder with their crappy rollout of probably the worst legalization system in the country, where you're not even allowed to vertically integrate. So all you did was pit the stores against the growers, which just compresses the price down to a point that there's no quality product at all. And the people that are trying to produce a high quality product are it's just a tough market for them.
Yep. So what are some of the genetics that you kind of miss from back in the 2000, like let's say the forum days, we'll say in the forum days, but before 2012, and we started seeing this crazy hybridization towards cakes and cookies and all that stuff. What are some of the ones that you really kind of reminisce about where you're like, God, I'd love to see like you and I talked about Trinity. And by the way, Adam Dunn says he has the real Trinity. So while you're in town, if you feel like talking to him, he's obviously
show me the weed.
Thing. Yeah.
Show me the weed.
Yeah, as you always say, show me the flower. I had that. It's funny because I had that clone, grew it, and I had saved that flower for you for a while. And same thing, it just got so old. I was like, dude, this is not a good representation.
There's some like good, even like a really well grown batch of biscotti almost has some burnt rubbery tones like the old Trinity did, but it was much more on like a chem level than what you see today. But with the Trinity, what I remember about it is that it had a really strong smell, and it was really resinous, small trichomes or small calyx bracts, but I don't remember the flavor translating my favorite necessarily. And I was going to say this earlier when I was thinking about the OG Kushes and the Face Off and the Poison.